The history of the 19th century was based on a big lie. And that lie was the idea that labor and capital are locked in an eternal battle with one another, two opposing forces doomed to fight to the very end. That idea became one of the foundations of modern economic thought. It shaped Karl Marx. It shaped the labor movement of the industrial age. And whether we realize it or not, it still shapes our politics today. We argue as though the world hasn't changed since the factory floor. Now, having said that, this is not how all economists saw the world. Adam Smith, writing in the pre-industrial age, understood that labor and capital could grow together. He believed productivity, not conflict, was the source of rising prosperity. But in one important respect, history did not follow Adam Smith. The institutions that we built, the factories, the corporate structures, were all designed around separation, not participation. And once ownership and labor were pulled apart, conflict became the default story. Early in my career, I experienced firsthand the dysfunction baked into this system. In the early 1990s, I was asked to take over a struggling information technology company owned by Bain Capital. Revenues were flat to declining. Morale was low. My job was simple: change the trajectory. It was also the first time in my life I was given stock options. Bain also gave me a block of shares and asked me to distribute it, but only to the senior management, the CFO, the head of sales, the leadership team. And so I did. I ran the company with a flat structure. There was a formal hierarchy, but people were encouraged to break rules and to contribute way beyond their titles, and they did. People worked with a level of dedication and tenacity that rarely appears unless people feel like owners, even though technically most of these people were not. A little bit more than 2 years into this, the turnaround had worked. The momentum was real, so real I didn't trust it. I went back to Bain and suggested we sell on the upswing. They agreed. We found multiple buyers, and 2 of them ended up bidding against each other. In the end, we sold the company for a whopping 17 times Bain's initial investment just 2 years earlier. We called an all-hands meeting in order to spread the news, to tell the story. I expected celebration. Instead, people started asking questions. Where's my share? They asked me. They asked the new owner. And the room got tense, fast. Eventually, the acquiring CEO pulled me aside and asked me to stop the meeting. He was visibly shaken and popping mad. On the long walk back to my office, he didn't say a word to me, and I felt like a man headed to the gallows. As we entered my office, he slammed the door behind us. Honestly, it felt like it was going to get physical. And I realized what had happened. People had heard about large payouts going to a very small group, and they asked a fair question. If we help build this, where is our stake? I felt terrible. We had created the feeling of ownership without the reward structure of ownership. And the truth was, the company succeeded against all odds because people behaved like owners. If there was a secret sauce to the turnaround, that was it. Now let me connect this story to something much bigger, America's story. In the late 19th century, as industrialization exploded, the United States faced a level of inequality that makes today look modest by comparison. I'm talking child labor, company towns, 12-hour workdays. The conflict between labor and capital was real, it was brutal, and sometimes even violent. But something interesting happened in the 20th century. The middle class emerged not because labor finally defeated capital. It emerged because millions of ordinary Americans became owners. For most of the 20th century, the primary asset that enabled ordinary Americans to become owners was housing. A house was much more than shelter. It appreciated over time. It could be borrowed against. It turned wages into wealth. Home ownership became the quiet engine of middle-class stability. But here's what's changed. By the numbers, housing no longer plays that role anymore. Entry costs have increased a lot faster than wages. Supply is constrained. And appreciation is uneven and increasingly concentrated in a handful of regions. For most average American families, home ownership now comes late or not at all. In the meantime, the center of value creation has shifted. The most powerful appreciating asset in the modern economy is no longer your home. They are companies. Equity in productive enterprises are what homeownership used to be, the most reliable entree into the middle class. For years, I reflected back on my personal story, and not just because of that harrowing moment I described, but because of what I thought it meant for capitalism itself. I began to believe there was a fundamental design flaw in capitalism. It just wasn't creating enough opportunity for enough individuals. And I didn't know how to fix the problem at scale without resorting to government coercion or government subsidies, without asking executives to act against their own financial interest. And then the question became clear. What if the conflict between labor and capital wasn't just moral, but informational? What if companies would naturally expand ownership if they could clearly see, as I had, that it increased firm value more than enough to compensate for the dilution? That question, more than anything else, has been the full focus of our research team for the last 3 years. Here's what the data tell us. Between 1980 and 2025, the S&P 500 grew by an astounding 5,000%. Meanwhile, median home prices increased by 500%. And real wages, are you ready for this? Increased by less than 20%. It gets worse. Did you know that only 11% of the S&P 500 companies extend equity grants to non-executive employees? Which frankly brings us to a crisis that we don't talk about honestly enough. A recent Gallup poll found that Gen Z, which will soon represent 30% of the labor force, is almost evenly divided between favoring capitalism and socialism. That should stop us cold, because large-scale socialist systems have repeatedly failed to deliver sustained prosperity. So, why is it that so many young people are abandoning capitalism? Well, the answer is that economic mobility is broken. In the 1940s, 90% of the children ended up making more than their parents. Fast forward to the 1980s, that number has dropped to 50%. And if you're born in the bottom 20th percentile, your chance of getting to the top 20th percentile, less than 6%. It's not the American dream. So what do? Some say redistribute income. A lot of people say that. Tax the rich more, give more to the poor. But history shows us that redistribution alone isn't sustainable. It treats the symptom, but not the structure. The real solution isn't redistribution, it's pre-distribution. It's making sure ownership is shared from the start. And this is not a radical idea. Ronald Reagan supported employee ownership. Bernie Sanders currently supports employee ownership because this is not about left versus right. It's about how the system actually works. Right now, the top 10% of Americans own 93% of all stock. That's where the wealth lives, in company stock. So here's the big idea. Don't abandon capitalism, double down on it by opening up the gates of employee ownership. Our research team starts with a very simple insight. The conflict between labor and capital isn't inevitable. It's informational. Until now, corporations have had no way to reliably measure the economic value of broad-based employee ownership. And so we're changing that. We are developing an employee ownership index and using AI to cut through data opacity, which is a fancy way of saying getting at the data that companies don't disclose. Our research shows that companies that have a high level of employee ownership systematically outperform the S&P 500 by roughly 25%. That changes everything because once that link is visible, this is no longer merely a moral argument. It's a fiduciary responsibility. As Peter Drucker would say, what gets measured gets managed. Armed with the right data, companies don't need to be persuaded to share the wealth. They'll do it first and foremost because it increases firm value. And by the way, it also attracts talent and reduces turnover and aligns incentives. And once ownership expands, something remarkable happens. People stop viewing growth as someone else's game. They stop viewing capitalism as extraction. And they begin to see a future where people can actually participate as opposed to a future that's dictated to them. And this matters not just economically, but politically. A society divided between owners and non-owners will always be unstable. It will always be highly polarized, and it'll always revert back to the same broken arguments about labor versus capital. The greatest lie of the 19th century was that labor and capital will always be enemies. The great task of our century is to transform them into allies. We've always known deep down that people show up differently when they're owners. I saw that with the people I worked with long before we had a chance to actually prove it. The problem was never belief. It was information. And so the question isn't whether capitalism needs to be replaced. It's what it becomes. It's what capitalism becomes once we can finally see in the data what we have always known to be true in our gut. Thank you.